My name is Dr. 3AM, and welcome to a philosophy video on the Hard Reboot Network. Today, we're going to look at the philosophies of Professor X and Martin Luther King Jr. and see if they are truly as similar as we think they are. Martin Luther King Jr. was a civil rights leader in the 1950s and 60s. He fought for equal rights of African Americans. He came from a Christian background and adapted a lot of his philosophy of peaceful civil disobedience from another civil rights leader, Mahatma Gandhi. As a parallel to King, Marvel Comics created Professor X, and while his people weren't persecuted by the color of their skin, they were persecuted for having dangerous superpowers. Looking back on this, superpowers presented a clear threat, whereas the real-life equivalent was based around fear tactics used by racist groups. They created a fear of the black community, that they were savage, rapists, and violent, among other horrific stereotypes. This was echoed in the X-Men comics by making the mutants out to be murderers or lack the ability to control their powers. They were segregated because of biological difference, much like the black community was at the time. I think at this point in the video, it's important to discuss the role of civil disobedience in a successful political system. One of the most famous examples in at least US history is the Boston Tea Party. This was a political protest involving throwing tea overboard that was being imported to the colonies. The main reason for this was the Parliament of Britain was taxing the colonies with no representatives present. There were other questions of the Parliament's power over the colonies as well. This was the incident mainly that sparked the revolution. What I'm trying to say with this example is that sometimes the needs of the people won't align with what we're told by our officials. The protests of the 60s were not the first and have certainly not been the last. And that's a good thing. Henry David Thoreau published a work called Civil Disobedience in 1849. Fun fact, this also had some influence on Mahatma Gandhi as well. In this was his response to the Mexican-American War, slavery, and other things he deemed unjust. Consider this a bit of a precursor to 60s civil activism. In the work, he poses the solution to war and slavery is to stop allowing use of your property and being for a cause that you disagree with, and to stop paying your taxes, to cut the funding to the institution that allows it. He was arrested for tax evasion, but never regretted what he did. He believed that voting would never be a true solution to the problems of the country. He said that everyone agrees that there are unjust laws. Whether or not you agree with the person on the opposite side of the political spectrum or not, everyone as a whole can agree that there are laws that don't seem right. That is a basic overview of the situation Thoreau laid out. But heading to the 60s once again, we have a time in recent history of mass protesting, riots, and civil activists, both peaceful and less so. Martin Luther King was of the mindset that goals can be achieved without violence and with diplomacy. In a sense, he believed that in order to fight injustices, you need to find common ground with your enemy to do that. Sometimes you had to force yourself upon them to be heard, but do it in a non-violent manner. He would hold public demonstrations, speeches, and marches through town to have his cause heard. Gaining momentum, he would be featured in the public eye through media. Charles Xavier thought much in the same way in the comics. He would speak of mutant kind in as many forums as possible. He would explain that mutants weren't out of control, but frightened, and that it was a perpetual cycle of humans and mutants being frightened of one another. Xavier made the case that with proper facilities and understanding that humankind would realize they weren't so different. King had something similar to fight for. The Jim Crow laws were still enacted and often forced black communities to use horrifyingly bad facilities for schools, housing, and many other things. King fought for years to get the southern United States desegregated. Charles Xavier created a school specifically so that mutants could have good facilities and a good education. He used this as an example of how mutants just wanted to be given equal footing in society, that really, they didn't want to harm anyone. Unfortunately, also advocating mutant rights was Eric Magnus Lenscher, or Magneto as he was known. He once was Charles's friend whom he'd debate philosophy with, but he ultimately decided that there was no way mutants and humans could exist peacefully and advocated mutant supremacy. King also faced a similar situation with Malcolm X. X was an advocate of the use of force against the oppression. He also believed that white and black people would never live peacefully, that these cultures were just too divided, and that the black race was supreme. During King's peaceful protests, X was involved with the Nation of Islam. As a note, this is a sect of Islam that does not represent the whole of the Islamic faith. They taught that the black race was supreme, and that force was necessary for change. As I said, this is in contrast of much of the Islamic ideals and culture today. X had a similar revelation when traveling to Mecca and seeing Muslims of all races peacefully interacting. Magneto and Malcolm X both posed a problem in the nonviolent protest and diplomacy of King and Xavier. The media would twist violent words and actions as a blanket stereotype for the black community in real life and for mutants in the comics, respectively. I'm going to keep it light on this topic because I'd like to come back to Magneto and X at some point. Again, we can see the parallels between fiction and history, and people say to keep politics out of comics. You remember that issue when Captain America punched Hitler in the jaw? The mutants were used to reflect many civil rights movements at the time. It was a way to bring attention to movements to an audience who may not have cared had they not had characters with similar struggles to look up to and get to know. While nuances of the movements may have been lost on the page, it made a new generation look up and say, this isn't right. King and Xavier shared the same goal in general: to achieve rights for a people looked down upon as lessers. They wanted to rise above stereotypes of their times and show people they were just that, a people deserving of the same rights. The mutants, and lately the Inhumans, a race similar to mutants, have been used as an allegory for any type of people who have had it unfairly. The black community, women, the LGBTQ community, Latinos, Muslims, anyone who's viewed inferior or different in some people's eyes. The mutants have always had a similar struggle. It started with Professor X in the 60s, and back then, who better to base his ideals on than Martin Luther King Jr.? But it hasn't ended with King. Persecution still exists, and oftentimes we're led by the media to believe that the newest threat to our way of life is a culture we don't fully understand. Now, both King and Xavier were not perfect people, but the important thing we have to remember is we're all human, and we all deserve to be treated with dignity. If we don't understand something, it's important for us to learn, even if it seems counterintuitive to our ideals. Maybe we have more in common than we thought. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like and subscribe and do the numerous other things that YouTube tells me to tell you to do. Well, until next time, this is Dr. 3AM, and I'm out.